Welcome to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. Do you wonder how your faith fits together with your profession? Well, join us as we explore how to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Well, hello again. This is Dr. Barry Schwenk, and welcome to Two Roads Crossing, podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission, where we explore the intersection of faith and veterinary medicine. You may have noticed I am alone today, which means that you're going to get the opportunity of listening in as I talk to myself, which doesn't happen. Well, no, it probably happens as frequently as you think it probably does. The reason why I'm here alone is because I was slated to attend and speak at the CVM CE conference in Nashville this year, but a few circumstances in my life changed, and that won't be possible. And I'm a little bit disappointed. Anytime that you get an opportunity to get together in person for a CVM function, I would encourage you to do so. It is normally very encouraging and uplifting. It's a great refresher, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to fulfill that obligation this year, and I feel really bad that I had to back out. And to be honest, it's a little bit embarrassing, and I don't like letting people down, and I don't like not fulfilling the commitments that I've made. There's someone else going to be stepping into my place. I'm sure they're going to do a great job with the conference. They'll find someone to fill in that gap, but it still makes me feel bad knowing that I've let a few folks down. Which is actually interesting because my sense of failure in this regard actually ties into the title of the presentation that I was going to give, which was called Redefining Failure, which is very ironic, I guess. But instead of sharing with you in Nashville, I wanted to maybe share a little bit of a condensed version of that talk with you here on the podcast, because I think for many of us, the fear of failure is very real. I saw a survey the other day, came out of the UK, where they polled adults in the UK, and the fear of failure actually had surpassed the fear of public speaking. Now, in that report, the number one fear was the fear of jump scares and horror movies, and the fear of failure came in number two. So I'm not really sure how accurate that poll was or how credible the source was, but I do think it's a rather significant thing that is worth talking about. For a lot of veterinarians, failure can be a pretty powerful thing. The sense of failure can be a very powerful thing. And you may not have maybe the kind of fear that paralyzes you, but dealing with failure is something that we all have to deal with. And it's sometimes even just the potential of failing can consume us. It can impact not just what we do, but even how we see ourselves. And that in and of itself can be rather damaging, not just professionally, but emotionally and spiritually as well. So in order for us to avoid falling into that trap, we need to maybe think critically and maybe a little bit realistically about failure. Failure is nothing more than an unmet expectation. And at the root of our fear, so at the very heart of failure, is this desire for us to control an outcome. So think about it, for a second here. We would say that our relationship failed because the expectations for our relationship weren't actually met, right? So if you consider a marriage to be failed, it's because you weren't married for 50 years. You weren't expecting to have the kind of insurmountable obstacles that maybe you were facing. If you say that your business failed, what you're probably saying is that the door's closed, and your expectation of it becoming a multi-site practice or you becoming a multi-millionaire, that expectation went unmet. So therefore you consider it a failure. Even as we treat patients, sometimes we say that our treatments failed because our patients didn't make the recovery that we expected them to make. Our expectation is that when we engage in treatment, that everything will return to normal, our patients will live forever. But it's just not always realistic. We come into it maybe with some misplaced expectations. See, what we see as failure is really an inability for us to control our circumstances in a way that the results are always exactly what we want. And in moments like that, what happens is that we usually blame ourselves, and we may blame God. Well, okay, let's be honest, it's probably more God's fault than it is our fault, right? I mean, we know what we wanted to do. We put in all of the hard work, we put in the long hours, we took all the necessary steps, we sacrificed blood, sweat, tears, and if things don't go our way, it has to mean that God has it out for us. God wasn't listening. He wasn't doing what we told him to do. Because the only other option then would mean that maybe we just weren't good enough, or that we didn't deserve the outcome that we wanted. Have you ever been to that place where you're kind of wrestling between whether it's God's fault or whether you just don't measure up? That sense of failure can become overwhelming. But what if I were to tell you that there's a third option? What if what we see as failure is nothing more than having misplaced or wrong expectations? What if your expectations are in the wrong place and what you see as a failure is actually a success? It means that what we would have to do is we would have to learn how to redefine failure. As Christian veterinarians, I think that we can all agree that our desire is to live lives that reflect Christ through our profession. For most of us, being a veterinarian is more than just a job, right? It's not just something that we do to pass the time or to earn money. And for most of us, it's even more than a profession. It's not just a set of skills or talents that we use to earn a living. For most of us, veterinary medicine is our vocation. It is our calling. It is our way of life. It's not just what we do, but it's who we are, who we were called to be, who we were created to be. And so to that end, as we approach veterinary medicine, we do so from an attitude of appreciation that's intertwined with our very being. And so we serve through our profession. We serve our patients. We serve our clients. We serve our teammates in a way that honors God and honors the calling to be veterinarians that he's placed on our lives. So when we think about failure in relationship to our vocation, we can sometimes see that failure as us letting God down. We see it as not meeting God's expectation for our lives, and that can be gut-wrenching and heartbreaking. I've actually experienced this a few times in my life. And once in Ethiopia, while our family was there working as missionaries, we were working with a fairly remote people group. And when we first arrived, their language had not yet been written down. There wasn't a language school to learn any of those things. And they generally didn't understand outside languages. So what that required for us to do is to find partners from other tribes, partners that we could hire as teachers and evangelists from these outside tribes who actually could understand their language as well as our language so we could communicate. After about 4 years into our work there was a labor dispute that actually led to our entire staff of teachers and evangelists going on strike, which is something that every missionary is well equipped and trained to handle, right? So it went horribly, horribly wrong. And as a result, everything stopped. The entire ministry came to a screeching halt. All village outreach stopped. All church services stopped. All of our schools were shut down. And who was at the very heart of it? Who is at the very middle? This guy, right? The one who single-handedly stopped the movement of God in northwestern Ethiopia. That's how it felt, right? It felt like I had single-handedly shut down this entire ministry effort. I had failed the community. I had failed my family. I'd failed our mission organization, all of our supporters. I had failed all the people that were depending on me. I failed myself, and I believe that I failed God. Those were some tough days. Those were some really tough days, and I remember them well. It felt like I couldn't breathe. I had a hard time catching my breath. I felt like I was drowning in pain and fear and guilt and shame. It was overwhelming. And looking back at it, I often associate that time of failure in my life with that story of Peter drowning in the sea in front of Jesus. I mean, the way that I had always understood that story was that Jesus called Peter out of the boat. Jesus called Peter out to do something amazing, but Peter failed. Instead of doing what Jesus had asked, Peter lacked the faith and he failed miserably. And honestly, he would have died if Jesus had not had pity on him and rescued him. But was that really the point of that story? Was that the point of that story really that Peter was such a great failure? Well, I was about to figure out that it really wasn't. That whole situation with Peter began with Peter's fear. He, along with all the other disciples, were afraid. And when Peter sees Jesus out on the water in the middle of that storm, he says to Jesus, look, if you're really here in this time where I'm horribly afraid, if you're right here in this fear with me, then let me walk out on the water to you. And that's what Jesus does. Jesus lets Peter do what he wants. He calls Peter out of the boat because Peter asked to get out of the boat. And here's the funny thing, though. Well, what exactly was Peter's motive? Peter wanted to get out of the boat so he could overcome his own fears. He wanted to get out of the boat so that he could do something miraculous. See, Peter's expectation was that he was going to walk out to Jesus. And then together, the two of them were going to stroll back to the boat together. See, success for Peter was having everyone else see him do what Jesus was doing. Now, did Jesus know that Peter was going to sink? Oh, absolutely, he did, right? So why then did Jesus let Peter get out of the boat in the first place? Why would he let Peter fail? Because success to Jesus was not Peter walking on the water. Success to Jesus was Peter drawing closer to him. And in the end, as Jesus puts Peter back in the boat, Jesus quiets the storm. And then all of the other disciples, having witnessed all of these things, all the disciples look at Jesus and they say, surely you are the Christ, the Son of God. See, the true failure of a believer is not sinking below the waves. It's not your imperfection. It's not your doubt. It's not even you making mistakes. The true failure of a believer is not drawing close to Jesus. Our true failure is trying to take the glory that belongs to him. See, that next Sunday in Ethiopia, we gathered together as a church, and I was beside myself. I couldn't sleep. I was grieving. I was angry. I was all these different emotions. And we walk into this church service on Sunday morning, and one of the elders gets up and explains to everyone there that there would really be no service. There was going to be no message from the word because all the evangelists were gone. My heart was breaking. And to some degree, I felt like everyone was kind of looking at me like this was my fault. I had failed them. And in so many ways, I couldn't see it any other way. My head was falling beneath the waves, and I felt like I was going to drown. But then there was this woman in the very back, and she stood up and she said, for a long time, the missionaries and the evangelists have walked beside us and taught us what they know. They showed us God and gave us his word so that one day we could walk on our own. And the time has come for us to do that today. From that point forward, the members of that church committed to taking responsibility for their own spiritual growth. It was at that point that the church in that very remote part of northwestern Ethiopia, that church became self-sufficient. Flash forward a handful of years. Last year, during a time of unrest, the church in that remote area was scattered. Many of the believers that we worked with were martyred for their faith. And in the wake of all of that persecution, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds have come to Christ and have been baptized. Village churches have been springing up everywhere, even to the point where those churches are reaching out to those that had originally reached out to them for the first time. See, in order for God to be glorified and in order for his church to draw closer to him, he allowed me to sink below the water and allowed everyone else to see that happen. So as I look back, I mean, I have to be honest, it hurt. It still hurts thinking about it. It was painful, but what I had called a failure was his success. And as a believer, I needed to learn how to redefine what I called failure. So how do we do that exactly? Well, first, we need to be seeking Jesus even in our fears. What do I mean by that? Well, Peter was calling out to Jesus in his fear. He didn't allow his fear to keep him from seeking Jesus or even calling out to him. See, far too often, we find ourselves paralyzed by our circumstances. So what do? Most often, we hide. Because when we hide, then that means that we don't have to step out. And if we don't step out, it means that we don't fail. But by not, we're also not being successful. Because by hiding away, we allow fear to keep us from the most fundamental aspect of being a believer, and that is following Jesus. See, in our fear, we need to seek Jesus. We need to be in prayer. We need to surround ourselves in fellowship with other believers that can encourage us. We need to be in the Word and in worship. We need to ask to join Jesus where he is, but not so that we can look good, but so that we are transformed by the power of his presence. So how exactly do we redefine failure? We seek him out in our fear, and then we step out to meet his expectations. Peter had his own set of expectations, right? We need to understand God's expectations. Look, you may be stepping out, let's say to open a new practice. Is your expectation to have a thriving business or to honor God no matter what the outcome? Is your expectation that you're going to use your business to provide jobs and support so many people in your community, or is it to draw closer to God and allow him to provide? See, when Jesus calls, we must follow his expectations. He is the one that must set the standard for success. That means that after we step out in his expectations, we need to then follow and walk in faith. Our eyes need to stay fixed on him. Our circumstances are not relevant, but his expectations are. So as we walk, we must walk in a manner worthy of his calling. We draw closer to him, and as we draw closer, the way we walk should be the way that he walks, with kindness and gentleness and love and patience and hope and joy and forgiveness. See, none of these things should be swayed by our circumstances. You're going to stumble. You're going to fall. But will you get up again in faith? Do you realize that God doesn't expect you to be perfect, but desires for his perfection to work in you and through you? When you get up in faith, it gives him the glory. We have to seek him out in our fear. We step out to meet his expectations. We walk in faith as we draw closer to him, and as we do, we give him glory. Much of what we define as success actually gives us glory. We build a reputation. We build a name for ourselves. We think of it in terms of maybe doing stuff for God, because God only wants and really deserves the things that we think are successful, right? But when we fail to meet our expectations, when things don't go according to our plans, there's still an opportunity for an outcome that gives him glory. See, many of the stories that we consider success stories center around what we did to accomplish what we wanted. We set the goal. We did the work. We got there. It's all focused on us. Now imagine what would have happened if Peter actually got what he had wanted. He would have done maybe a few laps around the boat, then maybe jumped back into the boat, got some high fives from all of his buddies. Notice that by Peter failing, he didn't receive the glory, but Jesus was glorified. And I would like to imagine that looking back, Peter probably realized that one of the greatest moments in his life was actually not getting what he wanted. Because by failing to meet his own expectations, he actually pointed to Jesus. See, if I'm completely honest, I wanted the same things that Peter had wanted. I had plans. I had a program. I was rather full of myself, but if everything had gone my way, then I would have received the glory that God was due. So we need to be honest with ourselves here. If we are really followers of Christ, it means that we need to decrease so that he can increase. So are you okay with being a failure in the world's eyes? Are you okay with being a failure even in your own eyes? Because when we redefine failure, what we're saying is that we will no longer determine success and failure for ourselves, but will humbly submit to God's standard. So look, maybe your business is struggling. You can still be successful. Your business may even fall apart. You can still be successful. Your success is not determined by your expectations anymore. It must be determined by God's expectations. So the only way for you to fail is if you harden your heart against his will for your life. You're going to make mistakes. So draw closer to him and give him the glory. You may stumble, you may even fall. Draw closer to God and give him the glory. You may experience places in your life where your head seems to be dipping below the waves. The only failure is failing to recognize that your Savior has been there all along, ready to wrap you up in his arms and carry you through the storm for his glory. What I called failure was actually rooted in my pride. And once I realized that, I actually arrived at a place where I could count my trials as joy. I finally got to a place where I saw that God's expectations were well beyond my wants. You might be wrestling with this idea of failure right now. You might be blaming God, or you might be letting your circumstances change how you see yourself. It's time to stop letting your pride rule your life. It's time to look beyond your circumstances because you are a child of God, a child that won't always get what they want. And it's not because you're a bad child, but because God is a good Father. So let's work together on this. Let's purpose together as a body that we will redefine failure and define success as God sees it. So we should seek him in our fears. We should step out to meet his expectations and then walk in faith to give God all the glory. Look, we're no longer slaves to our pride. So let your expectations go as you draw closer to God, giving him all praise, honor, and glory. For as we purpose to redefine failure and begin to live with God's standard of success, together, we can learn how to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Thank you for listening to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. If you were blessed by this content, like and subscribe so that you are alerted when new content is released. If you would like more information about CVM, or if you have questions, comments, or topical suggestions, you can find us online at www.cvm.org. Or you can contact us by emailing podcast@cvm.org. God has a plan for the nations, and that plan includes you. We pray that CVM has encouraged you to live out your calling with confidence and competence. So, until next time, may the voice of the shepherd ring loud and clear as you follow him in faith to the intersection of two roads crossing.